So my charge today is to talk to you about the history of the Grand Army of the Republic. So what I would like to do is start by asking, how many military veterans do we have in the room today? Okay. First of all, how about a round for these folks? Absolutely. So of you that are veterans, how many of you belong to a veterans organization, whether it's the American Legion, the VFW, AMVETS, DAV, whatever? How many of you belong to an organization like that? Okay. Those organizations, the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the AMVETS, these types of things, all kind of have their early history in the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic is not an army. So if you're here to hear about a battle that this army fought in or something like that, you're going to be sorely disappointed. The Grand Army of the Republic actually is a veterans organization that was created after the Civil War for Union veterans. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of what this organization was, what it did, kind of how it came to be, and a little bit of the history about it. It is by no means a comprehensive history of the GAR. Are there any old GAR posts or buildings still here locally? Are there some?
Not locally, but down in Peninsula.
In Peninsula? Okay. Okay. I know where I grew up, there was an old GAR building too. So some of you may be more familiar with the GAR than you think because, one, if you belong to one of these organizations like the Legion or the VFW, but also because depending on where you come from, you may have seen these buildings sort of throughout the landscape. A lot of those buildings are still out there. It was the GAR that really kind of created this whole idea that the other organizations that are still in existence today have kind of have adopted as, having local posts, and then they have kind of a national headquarters and all this kind of thing. So it does, because you're talking about a veterans organization, it does have something of a military structure, like the American Legion or the VFW today. They have a national commander and a local commander and a post commander and all this kind of stuff. So it's the same idea. So let's talk a little bit about the reason for this organization coming to pass. Of course, everybody knows the Civil War ended in 1865. You may get some argument from some people about whether or not it really ended with the surrender at Appomattox, because there were, as you all know probably, there were additional Confederate armies that still needed to surrender. But most people think of April of 1865, when Lee surrendered to Grant, as either the end of the war or really kind of the beginning of the end, and by May or so it was pretty much completely over. There's a great quote here from Grant up on the screen. This was actually supposedly this is something he said during the surrender ceremony at Appomattox, where as the Confederates were coming up and they were turning in their guidons and stacking arms, this kind of thing. Some of the Union soldiers started to cheer, which you can kind of understand. War's over finally, and Grant orders them to be quiet, to stop cheering, because the war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again. I'm not talking at all today about any Confederate veterans organizations. There were some. None of them were as big or as organized as the GAR. So I'm really focusing today on the GAR. However, there certainly were some more locally based Confederate veterans organizations as well, and you can certainly find information about those online or in books. So what was the impact of the Civil War? I mean, this is just really purely military impact, not even talking as much about social impact, but about over 700,000 killed. The old number was about 600 to 620,000. That's been revised in recent years to really add about 100,000 more killed. This could also include those that died of disease and things as well. So 720,000 people that died both north and south, around 500,000 wounded, and about 400,000 that were either captured or went missing. So it is a massive, massive conflict. And if I remember my numbers correctly, there were more casualties in the Civil War than all other American conflicts up to that point put together. So it was a massive, massive amount of casualties. And that has as much to do with sanitary conditions in camps, where guys got dysentery or even cholera, things like this that were still very common and killing people regularly, as well as things like more lethal weaponry. Rifled muskets and more accurate cannons, these types of things. So there's a lot of reasons that this war was so deadly. Also, just the number of people involved and the number of battles that took place. Here's where we get into more of the social aspects. About 4 million African Americans freed from slavery at the end of the Civil War. Of course, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. How many slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863? Well, not many. Why not? How many plantation owners in Mississippi or South Carolina ran out on January 1st, 1863 and said, well, Lincoln says slaves are free, I guess we got to let them go? I mean, Lincoln's a foreign leader to them, right? Sure. They're not listening to Abraham Lincoln, and certainly they don't expect Jefferson Davis to say anything like that. So ultimately, what the real benefit of the Emancipation Proclamation was that it stated publicly that if the Union wins the war, slavery will be abolished. Slavery will be abolished. So we have, by the end of the war, about 4 million African Americans who are freed from slavery. We've also answered the question of which power is supreme, the federal power or the state power, right? I mean, a lot of those Southerners that were in favor of secession, well, a lot of them flat out said, we're seceding because we think the North is trying to get rid of slavery. So, all of these folks today that say that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery need to go back and reread their history. But there also were a lot of people, primarily Southerners, saying that, the state power, that the North was trying to basically usurp the individual states' power. And the North is saying, well, the federal power is supreme to the state power, and the South a lot of times is saying something else. So those questions about whether or not the federal or the state power is supreme, and about whether or not a state can just pick up and leave the Union if it doesn't like a law or it doesn't like a social movement or something like that, those questions are answered by the war too, right? Because now we know we are one nation, indivisible. You can't secede. Once you're in, you're in. How many of you saw remember the old Gettysburg movie they made Out of the Killer Angels? You seen that? And there's that scene where General Kemper from the South was it Kemper or no? It was Pickett. It was Pickett. General Pickett is making the analogy that the country is like a gentleman's club, and they've started making some new rules that we don't agree with, so we're resigning from the club. And it was really as simple as that to a lot of people. That that the country is this very simple analogy. The country is similar to a gentleman's club, but it wasn't quite that simple. So that question is also answered by the Civil War. The Union is victorious, the Confederacy is defeated, therefore we now know federal power is supreme to the state power. So what about veterans? We have millions and millions of veterans returning home in the North and the South. What is going to happen to those veterans? Some of you may be old enough to remember the end of World War II or know about the end of World War II when all of these GIs started coming home and they had passed all of this great legislation like the GI Bill so that the country was kind of prepared for these guys to come home, right? They were going to have opportunities to get cheap mortgages. They were going to have opportunities to go to college. They were going to have opportunities to get job training because of things like the GI Bill. There was nothing quite that extensive for Civil War veterans coming home, North or South, certainly not in the South, because the South is pretty devastated both physically and economically at the end of the war. And even the North, which has fared much better in terms of its economy and its industry, still does not have any kind of mechanism in place for soldiers to come home and get educations or anything like that. So we've got millions of these guys coming home, including many, about 250,000 Black American veterans that fought for the Union as well. So some of these guys go home and try to sort of resume their normal lives. Some of them can't do that. I think if anyone's looking for a doctoral dissertation topic, the presence of PTSD, or what we now think of as PTSD in Civil War veterans, is a very rich topic that is just waiting for scholars to attack. But certainly there were, nobody I think was unaffected by what they had done during the war. Whether they served for 3 years or 3 months, whether they were in one battle or 100 battles, whether they were in the infantry or the cavalry, or they were in the rear echelon, nobody was unaffected by the service that they had given to the country. And eventually they started wanting to kind of be around other people who knew what they were going through, right? Isn't that why some of you joined those organizations like the VFW and the Legion, right? You want to be around people who know some of the things that you've been through, right? Makes sense. As far as veterans organizations in the United States, the earliest veterans organization that I'm aware of, at least, is the Society of the Cincinnati, which was formed by former Revolutionary War officers, American Revolutionary War officers in 1783, really basically right about the time that that war was coming to an end. So this is the first veterans organization that I know anything about. This organization actually still exists, by the way. As I was getting sort of ready for this program and I looked them up, they do still exist. They're more of a nonprofit, like an educational institution now, more so than a veterans organization. But in order to be a member of this organization, you still have to be able to trace your lineage back to, I believe it's to one of the founders of the organization. So it's a very small organization. So it's either back to one of the founding members or maybe back to somebody who fought in the Revolution. But I think it's even more limiting than that. I think you have to be able to go back to one of the founders. So the birth of the Grand Army of the Republic. This is Dr. Benjamin Stevenson, who was a surgeon for an Illinois infantry unit during the Civil War. And he's the guy that's credited with being the founder of the GAR. And this organization really came out of conversations that he used to have with a lot of people, specifically the guy that he kind of shared his tent with, who was the regimental chaplain, talking about, what is going to happen to us when we go home. When this war is over, and of course, keep in mind, nobody knew how long it would last. He's in a three-year regiment here, so he's there from 1861 to 64. What's going to happen to us when we go home? How are we going to process what we've been through, but also how are we going to keep in touch with the friends that we've made? Keep in mind, we're talking about the 1860s here. Nobody's texting each other or, checking in on Facebook and see how my buddies are doing or this kind of thing. So you actually had to make an effort to keep in touch with people. You had to write letters, you had to go see them, and going to see somebody was not as easy as hopping in your car or getting on an airplane either. So Stevenson is starting to sort of think about and talk about how are we, what are we going to do when we go home, and how are we going to be affected by this experience? And so when the war ended in April of 1866, really just a year or so after the end of the war, he founded the first GAR post. This was in Decatur, Illinois, and so he was kind of was the GAR for the next several months, and he was kind of the provisional commander of the organization for the next several months. So Stevenson is the guy that's really kind of credited with founding the GAR. He's not necessarily the guy that we think of as really the driving force behind the GAR. The guiding principles of the organization were fraternity, charity, and loyalty. Fraternity meaning brotherhood, of course, among soldiers who'd been through this sort of life-altering experience of serving in the Civil War. Charity meaning providing a helping hand to one another, to your fellow veterans, to your former brothers in arms, or to their families when needed. And then loyalty, remembering and honoring their loyalty to the nation and to each other. And I think to the nation, especially because this is a union organization, right? Remember, this is a northern organization. So loyalty to the nation is obviously a big, big deal because, of course, you can imagine how these guys felt about former Confederates who, in their view, were not loyal to the nation. One of the first things that the GAR really got involved with was trying to promote this idea of Decoration Day. And Decoration Day was intended as a day when veterans would go out and put flowers on the graves, mark the graves of their dead comrades. And so this is a copy of General Order Number 11, which was the General Order designating May 30th, 1868 as the first National Memorial Day. Now, there is some pretty decent evidence that the actual first Memorial Day was really in May of 1865, right after the war ended. There was a group of African Americans, former slaves in Charleston, South Carolina, that had kind of an impromptu ceremony at an area that had been a prison camp during the war, where they went out and kind of, had some kind of ceremony around the graves of these Union prisoners that had died in this camp. But the first real National Decoration Day is really the brainchild of the GAR. So that comes out of this General Order Number 11 and designates May 30th, 1868 as the first Decoration Day. This is John Logan from Illinois, and Logan was a politician, a Republican politician, who also obviously served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Logan is the guy, not Stevenson, Logan is the guy that is really credited with being the real driving force behind the GAR. Stevenson comes up with the idea and creates the first GAR post in Illinois in 1866, right after the war ends. But you'll notice, if I go back here, Stevenson was only the provisional commander of the GAR for about 6 months? So Logan, of course, also from Illinois, obviously knew Stevenson. Logan is the guy that kind of takes over the organization and starts to build it. So Logan is the guy that issues that general order that makes May 30th, 1868, the first National Decoration Day. And there was a ceremony that took place in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, probably everybody here knows the story of Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery was whose home before the Civil War? Lee. Yeah, Robert E. Lee. Right across the river from Washington, D.C. It was actually Lee's wife's ancestral home, I believe, but Lee and his family, of course, didn't stay at Arlington for very long after Lee resigned from the Army and cast his lot with the Confederacy. So pretty early in the war, that whole territory was taken over by the Union, and they started burying Union soldiers in what really was basically Robert E. Lee's front yard. That is the beginning of Arlington National Cemetery, what is now the most revered cemetery in all of America. I mean, two presidents and Supreme Court justices and Medal of Honor recipients and, all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of very distinguished Americans buried in Arlington National Cemetery. This is actually a photo from Arlington National Cemetery from that first Decoration Day on May 30th, 1868. Does anyone other than Debbie know who was the keynote speaker at the first National Decoration Day ceremony? Anybody know? Shame on all of you. It was James Garfield. Yeah. Shame on all of you. Now you are all obligated to come down the street this weekend and learn your Civil War history. Yeah, it was James Garfield. James Garfield, obviously, one of the most famous people to ever come out of Mentor, Ohio. I was somewhere recently and I said, James Garfield, the most famous resident ever of Mentor, Ohio. And at the end, somebody said, you may have to amend that depending on how Mitch Trubisky does for the Chicago Bears. But for the moment, we'll say James Garfield is probably the most famous person ever to come out to live in Mentor, Ohio. Garfield, obviously, if you've been down the street, Garfield's story. He grows up very poor and just he's like the classic American pull yourself up by your bootstraps story. Gets a great education, becomes an academic, speaks so many different languages, is just this brilliant guy. And then when the war begins in 1861, he feels, as many did, obligated to do his part for the Union, so he joins the Union Army and eventually rises to the rank of Major General. This actually shows him as a Brigadier General. This is obviously a colorized image of what was originally a black and white Matthew Brady photo. I think this is one of the best colorizations I've ever seen of a historical image. Sometimes they look, frankly, kind of corny. They look fake. This looks real to me. I think that whoever did this, even down to the blue eyes, which, if you read anything about Garfield or you read Peskin's book or anything like this, they talk about these piercing blue eyes he had. I think they even got that right in this. So this, to me, is like if the guy was standing here in front of me right now, this is what I really think he would look like. I think they did a fantastic job. And then, of course, the blue, to me, looks really, really strong on the uniform and everything. But anyway, Garfield has, a pretty successful career as a soldier during the Civil War, leaves the Army at the very end of 1863, goes to Washington to become a member of Congress. So by 1868, when this first National Decoration Day takes place at the behest of the Grand Army of the Republic, Garfield is very highly regarded as a very powerful speaker, a very articulate and eloquent speaker, and of course he has one of the main qualifications to really address this topic, which is he's a veteran. He's a member of the GAR. He's a Union vet. So he is a perfect person to speak at the very first National Decoration Day. And to his credit, in my view, Garfield did not run from what he thought the war was all about. Later in Civil War memory, and we'll get to some of that here in a few minutes, there was a tendency to kind of ignore the role that slavery played in this conflict. And that had a lot to do with not only what was going on in society at the time, but as these vets got older, they kind of wanted to maybe bury the hatchet a little bit, and they just wanted to talk about the valor of the soldiers. Didn't matter what side you fought for. Nobody was right. Nobody was wrong. We all did what we thought was best. And that was not James Garfield. Garfield is the guy who, 2 days after Fort Sumter, writes this letter where he says, "I'm glad we're defeated at Sumter. It will rouse the people. Better to lose 1 million men in battle than to let the government be subjugated." So, and I believe the war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. The world will so understand it, and I believe the outcome will redound to the good of humanity. So here, 2 days after Fort Sumter, James Garfield is saying, it's all about slavery, folks, obviously. 7 years later, here's Garfield, now a veteran, a GAR member, a congressman, addressing the nation's first National Decoration Day. And he says, "We began the war for the Union alone." Remember at the beginning of the war? We must preserve the Union. Abraham Lincoln said that, right? If I could preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. If I could preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. If I could preserve the Union by keeping some in bondage and releasing others, I would do that. Preserve the Union. Of course, when Lincoln wrote that, he also had the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk drawer. Anyway, we began the war for the Union alone, but we had not gone far into its darkness before a new element was added to the conflict, which filled the army and the nation with cheerful but intense religious enthusiasm. In lessons that could not be misunderstood, the nation was taught that God had linked to our own the destiny of an enslaved race, that their liberty and union were indeed one and inseparable. The soil beneath our feet, Arlington, right? Robert E. Lee's house. The soil beneath our feet was watered by the tears of slaves, in whose hearts the sight of yonder proud capital awakened no pride and inspired no hope. The face of the goddess that crowns it was turned towards the sea and not towards them. But thanks be to God, this arena of rebellion and slavery is a scene of violence and crime no longer. So here's Garfield at the first Decoration Day, again, 7 years later, reminding everybody why this war came, why it was fought, and why it was absolutely critical that the Union win. So James Garfield, of course, he died very young, tragically, but I think had he lived, he would not have been one of these guys that would have sat around at GAR reunions and said, "Oh, it doesn't really matter what it was all about. We can forget all that. It's water under the bridge. Let's all just sit around the campfire and talk about how brave we were." There's a place for all of that, don't get me wrong, but do we really even when we honor veterans today, do we do them a service if we forget why they're fighting? Or we just wrap ourselves in the flag and say, oh, anybody who disagrees or anybody who thinks differently is a traitor. You're not American, you're not patriotic. No, it's patriotic to ask questions. It's patriotic to want to know, why are we there? Is it worth American blood? And here's James Garfield asking and answering those questions just 3 years after the war ends. So Decoration Day sort of morphed into what we now call Memorial Day. What we now think of as Memorial Day, the last Monday in May when, we have parades and we honor service members killed in action and we put flags on the graves. That all started as Decoration Day. And so that holiday, Memorial Day, really has its founding in the Grand Army of the Republic. This is a great, great image that I found from Memorial Day of 1917, so 100 years ago, as the United States is ramping up to start sending troops over to Europe to fight in World War I. So you see these, the young boys, the little drummer boys, and then you see the two old Civil War veterans who are obviously, quite a bit older at this point. And then here we have sort of the brave Americans carrying the flag that are about to go over to Europe and fight World War I, including several grandsons of James and Lucretia Garfield, by the way. So honor the brave, Memorial Day, these sentiments and this holiday all have their basis in the Grand Army of the Republic. The GAR, by its very nature, got very involved in Republican politics because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation, the party of the Union, the party that saved the Union from the Confederacy and saved the Union from disunion and fought the war and made sure that the country was preserved. So by its very nature, the GAR became very much affiliated with the Republican Party. You did not have to be a Republican to be a member of the GAR, certainly, but just by its very nature and the mission that it created for itself, it became strongly allied with the Republican Party. And the GAR, especially in the early days, did very vocally support civil and political rights for black veterans as well as white veterans. Keep in mind, we have 200,000 or so African Americans that fought for the Union. That's another really important provision of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Not just saying emancipation of slavery is now part of what the Union is fighting for, but also the Emancipation Proclamation is also what? It's a military measure, right? Because it gives Lincoln the power to enlist black men into the Army and Navy and have them fight for the Union. And who had a stronger stake or a bigger stake in what was happening in this war than these black men that fought in the Army and the Navy? So the GAR, especially early on, does become very involved in promoting the idea of equality and civil and political rights for black Americans, specifically black veterans, but for black Americans in general, including voting rights. There were many, even Republicans who were not, thought black people should not be slaves, thought that they should be given equality, but weren't so sure about the whole idea of giving them the vote. And James Garfield even expressed that opinion at one time or another, that he just wasn't sure if that was the way to go or not, or should it wait a while or whatever. So, but the GAR did become an integrated organization. It accepted black veterans as members just as readily as white veterans. And there were some organizations created specifically for black veterans, but at this point, a lot of those veterans actually went to the GAR. Probably because it was integrated. I mean, after all, what had they fought for? The right to be equal, right? The right to associate with anyone they chose, including their brothers in arms, many of whom happened to be white. Now, as the 1870s progressed, as we went through Reconstruction, Republicans over time frankly got less and less vocal about civil rights for black Americans. And that actually affected the GAR as well, because as Republicans kind of started saying, okay, we've kind of done everything we need to do for these former slaves. We've passed constitutional amendments, we've made them citizens, we've given them suffrage, we've done enough. We don't really need to worry about them anymore. Let's move on to bigger and better things. As that attitude kind of started to be pervasive through the Republican Party starts looking for alliances elsewhere, like industrialists and financiers, things like that. That actually leads to kind of a waning of the influence and membership in the GAR as well. It's almost as if people kind of felt like, a lot of Republicans felt like they'd kind of accomplished their mission when it came to black Americans. A lot of members of the GAR seem to feel the same way, that we've kind of done what we needed to do here, so we can just kind of recede into the background now. And that was actually fairly common for Civil War veterans, North and South, during the 1870s. It was a time when a lot of people were kind of saying, okay, this war was terrible, let's just kind of forget about it and try to move on with our lives. It wasn't until a little bit later on that this sort of pride in service and things like that sort of made a pretty strong comeback. So the GAR kind of fades into the background for a while, doesn't go away completely, but certainly becomes less influential and has far fewer members until the late 1870s, early 1880s timeframe, when the GAR kind of became resurgent in trying to get pensions for veterans or their widows. There were hundreds of thousands of veterans out there, and many of them were trying to get pensions from the government for what they had, for the service that they had provided, especially those that had been wounded or injured somehow. So the GAR kind of revitalized itself by getting involved in trying to advocate for veterans to get pensions. And of course, if you're a vet or you know vets who are trying to get pensions and you know that this organization is trying to help you accomplish that, aren't you going to be a lot more apt to join that organization? Sure you are, because you agree with what they're trying to do or you support the mission that they're trying to undertake. So this move to increase pensions or to get pensions for Union veterans is a really major sort of thing along the road there for the GAR, because that led a lot of people back into the GAR. These are just some cartoons that kind of look, we'll say, unfavorably on Union veterans trying to get pensions. Here we have a soldier with about 20 arms dipping into the bowl that says U.S. Treasury and shoving coins into his mouth. And at the bottom there it says the insatiable glutton, meaning all these soldiers, these veterans are just a bunch of freeloaders that just want free money. And then here we have also from Puck, which was a real very popular sort of satirical magazine. We have Uncle Sam shoveling 160 billion yearly into the U.S. white elephant, which of course is pensions. So this is obviously a sort of satirical look at this drive for Union veterans to get pensions. I would not call these pro-pension by any means, but at any rate, these are some really interesting sort of looks at the other side of that argument, I guess you would say. So as I said, the new leadership of the GAR really used the pension battle as a way to revitalize the organization, get more people involved, and really make the GAR a powerful force again, a powerful force both socially and politically. And I put this quote in here from Lincoln's second inaugural: "To care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan." That speaks obviously to this battle that the GAR was fighting on behalf of veterans for pensions. Does anyone know what else is significant about this? This quote, "To care for him who shall have borne the battle." I think that's where it's now the motto of the Veterans Administration. So if you go to Washington, D.C., and you go to the VA, the main VA headquarters, that is actually on the building. That's the motto of the Veterans Administration: "To care for him who shall have borne the battle." So a lot of veterans returned to the GAR as they got more involved in this fight for pensions for their brothers in arms, and soon, as I said, the GAR kind of reemerged as a political force. And even today, we see presidential candidates and political candidates, going to talk to American Legion conventions and going to talk to veterans organizations and things like that. So that kind of really started here with the GAR, where politicians that were seeking high office felt like it was necessary to go interact with and really get the vote from the GAR, because there are millions of these Union veterans out there that are voting, and so political figures decide that these are people that they need to have some face time with. These 5 gentlemen all were Civil War veterans, all members of the GAR, and all presidents of the United States. Ulysses S. Grant, minorly involved in the Civil War. Rutherford B. Hayes, of course, with the 23rd Ohio, and very, very distinguished career, wounded several times. James Garfield over there, our dearly beloved James Garfield to the right. Benjamin Harrison down here from Indiana. And then William McKinley, also from Ohio. So Grant, Hayes, Garfield, McKinley, all Ohioans, or born in Ohio at least. Grant is more famously associated with Illinois, but he was born in Ohio. And then was Harrison born in Ohio as well? No. But he lived in Ohio for a time as a young man, is that right? Before he moved to Indianapolis, maybe? I don't know. Well, Indiana's pretty close to Ohio, so we'll just claim him anyway. How about that? So at any rate, all 5 of these guys were Civil War veterans, were GAR members, and were presidents of the United States. Anyone ever been to Antietam? Surely some of you have been there. The 23rd Ohio, which was the unit that McKinley and Hayes both started out in, which is hard to believe. One regiment produced 2 presidents of the United States. Pretty amazing. I don't know if it's the 23rd Ohio, but I know that the last time I was at Antietam, it's been a long time, but there's actually a monument there that says, Private William McKinley, who was later Major William McKinley, by the way. He must have been pretty distinguished if he got a battlefield commission. Served coffee, to Union soldiers on this approximate location on September 17th, 1862. So anyway, that's, I remember when I went to Antietam the first time and saw that, I thought, wow, 1, is that McKinley the president? And 2, what a strange thing to have a monument for. But I guess if you become president of the United States, they'll put up a monument for just about anything you did, up to and including serving coffee. Something else that the GAR got very involved in was putting together and promoting these soldier reunions. Later, as we get into the 1880s, 1890s, and even into the early 20th century, soldier reunions became very popular. And so we have, really every year the GAR had a national encampment, but there also were smaller individual reunions as well. And up here on the table, I have these two frames here, have reunion ribbons in them primarily from the 42nd Ohio, which is the unit that James Garfield helped organize and commanded for a time as well. So when we're done today, if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer questions. But if you want to come up and look at the ribbons, you can do that as well. I'll have to take those when I leave, but they're there if you want to take a look at them afterwards. And then we also have a placard up here with the names of mentor residents who fought in the Civil War and were members of the Grand Army of the Republic as well. Just some great photos here from some of these soldier reunions, and you think of these guys as young men out there fighting this horrible war, and then here they are, 20 or 30 years later as older men, which, as we all get older, right? And yet here they are still remembering their service, belonging to the GAR and getting together with their former comrades from time to time, and of course see the Stars and Stripes behind them here. Now the biggest, probably most well-known reunion took place at Gettysburg in 1913. It was the 50th anniversary of the battle. So this is a very famous photo, you've probably seen it before, of these Union veterans here on the left and Confederate veterans on the right, shaking hands over basically in the general vicinity of Pickett's charge. And of course it's completely staged, and you can even see photographers and stuff in the background there. But this is supposed to symbolize the country kind of coming back together. And it also speaks to what I referred to earlier was this whole idea that eventually, why we fought becomes less important rather than, both sides were honorable and noble and valorous, and let's just forget about why we were fighting this terrible war and focus on the fact that we were all brave and we all did what we thought was right. So this Gettysburg 50th anniversary reunion is kind of steeped in that whole sort of strain of Civil War memory, where people were talking less and less about why the war happened and talking more and more about what happened. This is where you get, even when you go to national parks today, they're very, very heavy on military history. This regiment went this way and this corps went this way and then this brigade charged up the middle, and that's all very important, but it doesn't really address why they were fighting in the first place. Here's another image from that same Gettysburg 1913 reunion. You've got Union vets on the left here and Confederate veterans on the right, stars and bars and stars and stripes, and everybody's happy and we were all brave and it doesn't matter what it was all about. And the keynote speaker at this event was Woodrow Wilson, who was at that point the newly inaugurated President of the United States. He'd become president in March of 1913. This took place in July of 1913. So here's an excerpt from his speech, and I have the entire speech right here. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is it's not that lengthy, but it would still take me a while to stand here and read it. But I'll just read the excerpt that's here on the screen. I need not tell you what the Battle of Gettysburg meant. These gallant men in blue and gray sit all about us here. Many of them met upon this ground in grim and deadly struggle. Upon these famous fields and hillsides, their comrades died about them. In their presence, it were an impertinence to discourse upon how the battle went, how it ended, what it signified. But 50 years have gone by since then, and I crave the privilege of speaking to you for a few minutes of what those 50 years have meant. Here's his opportunity to say something really bold. What have they meant? They have meant peace and union and vigor and the maturity and might of a great nation. How wholesome and healing the peace has been. We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion, and of the men then arrayed against one another, now grasping hands and smiling into each other's eyes. How complete the union has become and how dear to all of us, how unquestioned, how benign and majestic, as state after state has been added to this, our great family of free men. How handsome the vigor, the maturity, the might of the great nation we love with undivided hearts. How full of large and confident promises that a life will be wrought out that will crown its strength with gracious justice and with a happy welfare that will touch all alike with deep contentment. We are debtors to those 50 crowded years. They have made us heirs to a mighty heritage. And on and on and on and on it goes. With no mention of slavery, with no mention of why the battle took place, because what difference does it make? The quarrel has been forgotten anyway, right? How do you think those GAR members felt about this? Now, some of them, yes, were very much wrapped up in this kind of what they call reconciliationist vein of Civil War memory, yes, but there were plenty of them that were not. There were plenty of them who sat around their campfires at night and said, I don't care what Woodrow Wilson has to say, we were right, they were wrong. So this is the kind of stuff, I'll say stuff, I don't want to say anything more strong than that. This is the kind of stuff that I think James Garfield would have absolutely pulled his hair out about. I mean, remember what he was saying in 1861 and 1868, and here we are 40 or 50 years later, and hey, the quarrel's been forgotten. It doesn't really matter what it was all about. Now, what do we know about Woodrow Wilson? He's born in the South, right? Yes. Born in Virginia, raised partially in Georgia. His dad was I believe his dad was a minister, but you know, Wilson grew up kind of revering these Confederate veterans that were very much around him as a boy. And even as he got older and he moved to the North, he carried that idea, that Southern perspective with him. So, we think of Wilson as being president coming from New Jersey, because he was governor of New Jersey before he was president. And of course, before he was governor of New Jersey, he was president of Princeton University, not a bad school. But he actually came from the South. He was born in Virginia and he was raised in Georgia. So he actually came from the South, and he brought that sort of Southern perspective with him. And segregation and things like that all increased during Wilson's term as president. So Wilson did a lot of good things. Don't get me wrong. I mean, he led the country through World War I and all this kind of stuff. So I'm not down on Wilson about everything, but I think he missed a great opportunity here as the leader of the nation to really encapsulate and try to at least address why these men 50 years before had been on this field fighting each other and why so many of their friends were buried there. So the end of the GAR, this is Albert Wilson from Duluth, Minnesota, and he was the last surviving Union veteran of the Civil War. So when this guy died, that was the end of the GAR. He lived to be 106, so he had a pretty good run. But he enlisted in the Union Army in 1864 or 5, something like that. I mean, so he's he's a teenager basically. And then he lived until 1956. The last national encampment of the GAR was in Indianapolis in 1949, and Wilson was there. But you can imagine how many guys were left in 1949. I mean, if you read some of the recollections of soldiers at that Gettysburg reunion in 1913, 50 years later, many of them are kind of lamenting how many of their friends did not make it this far. And I don't just mean friends that died in the battle. I mean who have died, in the 50 years since that, so-and-so would have so enjoyed this reunion, and unfortunately, he died last year or 10 years ago or whatever. So even as early as 1913, veterans are talking about, how many of their friends didn't make it that far. I guess today we would maybe sort of think about it like, we talk about how many World War II veterans we're losing, every single day. So that, in maybe 10 years or so, we probably won't have any of those guys left, unfortunately. So it's the same idea here. They do have a final GAR encampment in 1949 in Indianapolis, but you can imagine how many, just a smattering of Union veterans that were still alive at that point. And this statue over here of Wilson is actually at Gettysburg. They do have a statue of him as the last surviving member of the Grand Army of the Republic. So the Grand Army of the Republic starts very small with Benjamin Stevenson in Illinois in 1866. And 90 years later, it's down to one member, this 106-year-old guy in Minnesota who dies in August of 1956. And that is basically the end of the Grand Army of the Republic. But as I said, the GAR, some of our more modern veterans organizations like the Legion and the VFW, things like that, really kind of they model themselves on and take a lot of their ceremonies and things like that and their lineage from the GAR. So even though there are obviously no no veterans of the Civil War left alive and haven't been for decades now. I think the idea of the GAR and the legacy of the GAR is still alive in some of those more modern veterans organizations. So.